He loved to show off his status as a successful businessman. She struggled to feed her twin daughters every day on the cold streets. An unexpected reunion brings up forgotten memories of a romantic past. And now, the biggest surprise of his life. He has 2 daughters he never knew about. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, subscribe to the channel and let's get started. Jonathan gazed at his watch in the back seat of the car, tapping his foot against the sleek leather floor. The numbers on his Rolex seemed to accuse him of running late, and he couldn't shake a sense of dread creeping over him. He exhaled, raked a hand through his perfectly styled hair, and lifted his phone when it vibrated on the seat beside him. "Sir, are you almost here?" Grace's voice came through, calm but urgent. "I'm pulling up," Jonathan replied, glancing out the tinted window. "Give me 2 minutes." "I've tried to stall the opening announcements, but reporters are asking questions," she said. "They expected you 15 minutes ago." He muttered a quick apology and ended the call. As much as he usually enjoyed making a punctual entrance, he'd felt strangely on edge the entire morning. He was the face of the event, a charity fundraiser organized under his own name, yet his stomach knotted whenever he thought about it. There was a rawness to the idea of helping those less fortunate, a stab of memory reminding him that he hadn't always been this wealthy, this polished. The car slowed at the curb in front of a grand building whose wide steps led to a pair of ornate glass doors. Behind those doors, the philanthropic gala was in full swing, complete with a glitzy red carpet and shimmering decorations. Even at a distance, he could see bright camera flashes, expensive suits, and elaborate gowns. Public relations people guided VIP guests into the venue, trying to maintain order. Jonathan stepped out with a controlled exhale, straightening his jacket. Heads turned his way. Cameras pivoted. Paparazzi shouted questions, and he responded with a practiced, gracious smile. He waved a hand to indicate that he'd be inside shortly, ignoring the cacophony of voices calling his name. Still, something nagged him, as though he could sense a storm brewing. He forced himself to cross the red carpet with an air of confidence, stopping here and there to exchange pleasantries, but always scanning the scene for whatever might feel off. He spotted Grace standing at the entrance in a tasteful business suit, a rigid posture hinting at her concern. As soon as he joined her, she leaned in. "Press is eager to hear your statement," she said, tilting her head toward the throng of journalists. "You'll need to address them before the keynote speech." Jonathan nodded, trying not to let his unease show. "Let's get it over with." They began to walk inside when a scuffle broke out near the side entrance, where security guards flanked the doorway. Jonathan paused, eyes narrowing. A pair of uniformed guards stood over a woman who looked utterly exhausted, her hair disheveled, clothes rumpled. A moment later, he noticed 2 small figures behind her, twin girls, maybe 6 or 7, cowering as the guards barked orders. He expected the woman to back down and leave, but she held her ground, palms up in desperation. The younger of the twins clung to her side, trembling. For a split second, Jonathan considered stepping past, leaving it to the guards. After all, he had an entire event waiting on him. But the woman's face struck a chord deep in his memory, and something made him halt. "Grace," he said quietly. "Who is that?" Grace followed his gaze. "I'm not certain. She must have tried to enter without an invitation." Jonathan handed his briefcase to Grace. "I'll be right back." She called after him, but he strode across the polished marble floor toward the commotion. At first, the guards didn't notice him approach. Then one caught sight of his expensive suit and recognized him. Immediately, both men stood straighter. "Sir, this woman's—" Jonathan raised a hand, and the guard fell silent. He turned to the woman, whose cheeks were flushed and eyes slightly red. When she looked up at him, it felt like someone had punched him in the chest. He knew that face. He'd dreamed of it countless times. It was Megan from his college days, the woman he once thought he could never live without. "Megan," he breathed, taking a step back as a wave of disbelief washed over him. The last time he saw her, they were both young and full of plans for the future, but she'd vanished without a trace, leaving him with only unanswered questions. Over the years, he'd convinced himself she'd moved on or found someone else. Yet here she was, disheveled and cornered by security, and the two children peering out from behind her could only be her daughters. "Jonathan," she said, her voice low and brimming with complicated emotions. A flicker of memory hit him. Late-night study sessions, shared laughter, warm embraces. He swallowed hard. Then his gaze dropped to the twins, who stared at him with wide, uncertain eyes. He caught a glimpse of something in their expressions, a spark, a reflection that chilled him and at the same time made his heart pound. There was a familiarity in the shape of their faces or perhaps the color of their eyes. It was like staring at a mirror but smaller and more innocent. "You know each other?" one guard asked, now looking unsure. Jonathan cleared his throat. "Yes, we—" He hesitated, glancing at Megan, who stood protectively in front of the girls. He was about to ask what she was doing here when he noticed a cheap duffel bag resting against her leg, tattered at the seams. One of the twins huddled close to her sister, as if trying to hide from the watchful eyes in the lobby. The mixture of fear and curiosity on their young faces sent a jolt through him. Was it possible? Could they— "Excuse me, Mr. Turner," another staff member interjected. "We can't allow vagrants or solicitors to remain in the building. She doesn't have a ticket or credentials." Jonathan turned sharply, voice firm but controlled. "This is a charitable event, isn't it? The whole point is to help people in need." The staffer swallowed. "Yes, sir, but—" "No buts," Jonathan interrupted. He shifted his attention to the guards. "Stand down. I'll handle this." They stepped back, clearly confused but obeying his authority. In the hush that followed, a few onlookers gathered, uncertain whether to watch or move along. Somewhere behind him, reporters were still chatting among themselves, and he could almost feel their cameras turning in his direction. Grace hovered nearby, her brow furrowed. She offered him a look that seemed to ask if everything was all right, as though she could sense something was off about the situation. Jonathan gave a small shake of his head, indicating he wasn't sure yet, then returned his gaze to Megan. She looked tired. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept well in a long time. Still, she tried to stand tall, her shoulders squared as though ready for a fight. "We just needed a place to rest," she said. "We weren't harming anyone." Jonathan steadied his breath. "Megan," he whispered, I had no idea you were in such circumstances." She pursed her lips, her expression flickering between embarrassment and defiance. The twins clung to her, their small fingers clutching the fabric of her jacket. Jonathan's pulse hammered, and he found himself staring at the children with a sense of shock he couldn't contain. "Mr. Turner!" a voice called from across the lobby, possibly one of the event sponsors or a photographer. Jonathan ignored them, lifting a hand to wave them off. Right now, everything else faded in comparison to the reality standing in front of him. A swirl of contradictory emotions twisted in his chest. Regret for the years apart, confusion over how this had happened, and a faint glimmer of longing for the time they'd lost. "Please," Megan said, shifting her gaze to the guards and then back to Jonathan, "just let us leave. We'll go." He caught the tremor in her voice, the way her hands trembled slightly when one of the twins tried to cling to her arm. The child peeked out and made brief eye contact with Jonathan. He felt as if he'd been struck by lightning. "You can stay," he insisted, gesturing toward the guards to back away completely. "We have extra seats, the refreshments, the lobby area, whatever you need." A stunned silence settled over the staff. Grace took a small step forward, picking up on Jonathan's strain. She gave Megan and the girls a reassuring smile. "Please let me know if you need anything at all. Food, drinks, a quieter space." Then she turned to the curious onlookers. "Everything is under control. One by one, people drifted back to their tasks, though a subdued tension lingered. Jonathan glanced around the ornate foyer, crystal chandeliers, polished floors, lavish flower arrangements. It all felt strangely out of place next to Megan's weary stance and the twins' fragile expressions. Before any of them could say another word, Megan's eyes flicked to the girls. Their resemblance to Jonathan was unmissable, and he felt an odd flutter in his chest. He pressed his lips together, wanting to ask 1,000 questions but finding himself tongue-tied. In that moment, he saw an echo of himself in those tiny features, as if a hidden part of his past had materialized right before his eyes. "Let them stay," he repeated more quietly, directing his words to anyone who might still be listening. "This is a charity event. We're here to help." The security guards exchanged a glance, muttering their apologies as they retreated, leaving Megan and the twins standing in a small circle of calm amid the bustle of the gala. People tried not to stare, but curiosity radiated from every corner. Jonathan felt as though the world had tilted, that nothing made sense anymore. He was supposed to be the confident businessman, striding in to make speeches and sign checks. Instead, he was face to face with someone who reminded him who he used to be, who he might have been. Grace, ever efficient, tried to usher them into a side corridor. Megan followed, uncertain, and the twins clung to her arms. Jonathan stood there for a second, letting the moment wash over him. Then he caught up, walking at Megan's side. He wanted to say something reassuring, something that would ease the pained look on her face, but the words wouldn't form. At the end of the hallway, the noise from the main auditorium faded. Megan looked up at Jonathan, her expression a whirlwind of relief, anger, and a dash of lingering warmth. She let out a long breath, as though she'd been holding it in forever. He reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Megan, She drew back, eyes flashing. "Don't," she said, voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "Don't act like this is some small misunderstanding. You and I both know how complicated it is." He stared at her, questions bubbling inside, but the sting of her words rooted him in place. He realized they weren't alone. Grace stood close, waiting to see if there was anything she should do, and the twins watched uncertainly from Megan's side. A hush settled around them all. Security guards hovered a short distance away, as if still unsure whether to intervene. From the distant part of the building, the sounds of the event carried on. The murmur of mingling guests, clinking glasses, a polite announcement about the official program beginning soon. Megan looked at Jonathan again, her eyes filled with conflicting emotions. A wave of recognition swept over him, reminding him of how determined she'd once been, how fearless she could look when standing up for something she believed in. Her stance wavered, though, betraying her fatigue. As security reluctantly left them alone, Megan turned to Jonathan with a mixture of relief and anger, murmuring, You shouldn't have come back into our lives." Jonathan stood there, heart racing, with more questions than answers. Jonathan stood speechless in the quiet hallway, still absorbing the shock of Megan's words. A startled hush lingered among the nearby staff as she clutched her twin girls close, her entire posture rigid and defiant. After so many years of wondering and imagining where she might have gone, he never expected to find her like this, certainly not at his own charity event, threatened by security. And her warning echoed in his mind. "You shouldn't have come back into our lives." He tried to steady his breathing, to speak in a voice that might reassure her. "Megan," he said softly, "I'm not here to make things worse. I just want to know what happened. Why did you—" A flicker of pain crossed her face and she shook her head. "It doesn't matter anymore, Jonathan. Things are different now." The twins trembled behind her, their eyes darting from the marbled floor to the well-dressed people milling nearby. Jonathan's stomach turned. He recalled a carefree college girl who once laughed easily, who spoke of travel and big dreams with a spark in her eyes. Now she looked worn and wary, battered by realities he could only guess at. An older sponsor wearing a tailored suit approached from the other end of the corridor. He cleared his throat, eyeing Jonathan with forced politeness. "Mr. Turner, the keynote is about to start. Are you—" "I'll be right there," Jonathan said with more edge than intended. The sponsor blinked, gave Megan and the twins an uncertain glance, and then backed away. Jonathan turned back to Megan. "Come with me," he said, carefully modulating his tone. "We can talk in my office upstairs. It's private. The kids, they don't need to be in this crowd." Megan stiffened, considering the earnestness in his eyes. The twins were clearly overwhelmed, and the press had begun to stir in the main lobby, sniffing out some new angle to exploit. After a beat, she gave a grudging nod. Grace, who'd been hovering nearby, jumped into action, waving over a sympathetic staff member who fetched bottles of water and pointed them toward a staircase tucked behind a decorative partition. One of the girls clung to Megan's coat as they climbed, her small legs practically dragging. The other child kept glancing at Jonathan as if trying to puzzle him out. He offered a hesitant smile, unsure how else to bridge the distance. When they reached a carpeted hallway on the second floor, the din of the gala below became a muffled hum. Jonathan's office was modest by his usual standards, more a quiet retreat than a grand executive suite. He opened the door and gestured Megan and the girls inside. Grace lingered in the hall to intercept any intruders. The room was tastefully decorated with a dark wooden desk, bookshelves lined with trophies and plaques, and a few comfortable chairs. Megan guided the twins to a small sofa where they huddled close. Jonathan noticed how thin they looked, as though a good meal hadn't been part of their routine for a long time. He took a seat in an armchair opposite them, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, trying to appear less intimidating. Megan glanced around cautiously, her protective gaze never leaving her daughters for long. They stayed silent for a heavy moment, the air thick with unfinished business. Jonathan finally cleared his throat. "Are you all right?" he asked, voice low. "Did the guards hurt you?" She shook her head but didn't relax. "No, they just thought we were causing trouble." He pushed a hand through his hair. "Why were you even there, Megan? You seemed like you were looking for something, or someone." A humorless laugh escaped her lips. "I didn't know you'd be there in person. The flyer said your charity provided food and shelter resources. I thought maybe I could get some hot meals for the girls, or a lead on a job." Her expression darkened. "I didn't expect a spotlight to turn on us the moment we walked in." Jonathan ran his gaze over the children, noticing how closely they resembled each other, two versions of the same solemn face. A pang clutched his heart as he realized how they might also bear traces of him, something in the shape of the chin, the slight arch of the brows. He wanted to ask about their birthdays, their school, everything he had missed. Instead, he forced himself to focus on Megan's last comment. He hesitated, then said, "I sponsor that event annually. It's supposed to help people in need. I'm sorry you were treated like that." A moment of stillness settled. One of the twins nudged the other, who was absently twisting a piece of fabric on her worn sweater. Suddenly, Megan let out a slow breath. "Look, I don't want a scene, and I especially don't want your money, not after everything that happened." Her words stung. He leaned back in the chair, searching for the right response. "You said I shouldn't have come back into your lives," he ventured, "but I had no idea where you went. You disappeared without any explanation. Every letter I wrote came back unopened. I tried calling and it was like you vanished." She cast her eyes downward. "It wasn't my choice. You think I wanted to walk away?" She curled her arm protectively around the girls. "I had nowhere else to go, Jonathan. Someone made sure I stayed away. Someone with more power than I could handle." His heart rate surged. "What do you mean?" He recalled the hushed rumors from their college days, the strange circumstances of her sudden departure. But he'd never pieced it together. "Did someone threaten you?" She looked at him sideways, not giving a direct answer, clearly fighting with herself over what to reveal. "Let's just say money was involved, a lot of it, and promises that I'd be taken care of. but those promises dried up the moment I was out of your orbit." Confusion and anger sparked in Jonathan's chest. "Money? From who?" She shook her head firmly, eyes flicking to the door where Grace might be listening. "Don't," Megan said quietly. "Don't dig into this. It's complicated, and it won't help anyone to open that wound, not when you're tied to these people." "Tied to who?" Jonathan pressed, leaning forward again, though he tried to keep his voice low to avoid scaring the children. "Megan, if someone forced you out of my life, I need to know." She hesitated, lips pressed tight. Meanwhile, one of the twins peeked at him more boldly, as though studying his face to see if he could be trusted. Jonathan offered her a gentle smile. The girl had Megan's dark hair and the same fierce spark in her eyes. He felt an ache of longing for all the lost years. Megan took a measured breath, turning her focus back to Jonathan. "Look at you," she said almost bitterly. "All successful. I saw your picture on billboards, read stories about your expansions. You're probably negotiating billion-dollar deals while we're sharing a single bed in a rundown shelter some nights." He felt an intense mixture of guilt and sorrow, but also confusion. "I can't change the past," he said quietly. "I wish I'd known about you, about the twins. Maybe I could have helped." She scoffed. "You really think whoever paid me off would let me waltz back into your life? They knew exactly how to keep me silent, and if the money didn't work, well..." She trailed off, her expression haunted. A knock on the door interrupted. Grace poked her head in. "Jonathan, the press is... they're getting restless. Are you planning to speak soon?" He glanced at Megan, then back at Grace. "Can we hold them off a little longer?" Grace frowned but nodded. "I'll do my best." When the door clicked shut, he turned to Megan. "They'll start speculating if we don't show our faces. I don't want to drag you and the girls in front of a camera, but I also can't pretend I don't know you." The girls looked anxious, their small shoulders hunched. Megan smoothed a palm over one daughter's hair. "We've managed to stay anonymous for so long," she said. "This is the last thing I want." She sighed, heavy with resignation. "Whatever power circle you're part of, Jonathan, they'll try to keep me on the streets, out of the picture." He shook his head. "They can't do that if I stand up for you. This is my event, my money. I can protect you." She gave him a weary look, as if she'd heard every promise in the world, but knew better than to believe them. "Your reputation is built on being squeaky clean. Are you sure you want to risk that by showing up with a homeless woman and her kids who might or might not be yours?" His throat felt tight. "If you're implying the twins, are they—" He couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence, terrified of the answer. Megan inhaled sharply and shook her head, dodging the question. "It doesn't matter who their father is. Right now, their only concern is getting through each day without being looked down on or chased off." He swallowed hard, the implication hanging in the air. "It matters to me. You matter to me. And if they're my daughters..." His voice faded, thick with emotion. "I lost you once. I don't want to lose you again without understanding what happened." A flicker of vulnerability showed in Megan's eyes. "We can't do this here," she murmured, glancing at the door again, aware that time was running short before the event staff or paparazzi would come searching. "If you're serious about helping, we'll talk when things calm down." He nodded, his heart in turmoil. "Promise me you won't vanish again." "I can't promise you that," she said quietly. "If I see any hint of danger to my girls, I'll disappear. I've done it before." Anger and helplessness warred inside Jonathan. "I won't let anyone hurt you, or them." He paused, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Who's behind all this? You said money was involved." She rose slowly, taking the twins by the hand. The children looked relieved to leave, as if they dreaded being inside an unfamiliar office. "You can't fight people you don't even know exist," Megan said, fixing her gaze on him. "There are players in your world who won't hesitate to ruin you, to ruin me and these girls, just to keep a perfect image." He stood as well, anxious to stop her from leaving until he had more answers. But one of the twins shrank back, unnerved by his sudden movement, and Megan shot him a warning look. He lifted his hands in a gesture of peace. "Let me do something at least," he said. "Megan, please." She hesitated, then nodded, allowing him to step ahead and open the office door. Grace waited outside, scanning her phone. She glanced up questioningly. Megan's voice was almost a whisper, directed at Jonathan and no one else. "I need to get these girls out of here before anyone notices us, but we'll talk. Give me a number I can actually reach you on, something that won't go through your secretary." Jonathan scribbled his personal cell onto a slip of paper he found on his desk. He handed it to her. The tension hung heavily between them as she stuffed it into her pocket. With that, she guided the twins down the hall, disappearing with quick, silent steps, like she couldn't leave fast enough. He watched her go, his heart pounding with dread for whatever new truths might come to light. Grace touched his arm gently, bringing him back to reality. "The sponsors are waiting," she murmured. He nodded, trying to calm the swirl of emotions. "Let's do it." Together they headed for the main staircase, preparing to face the crowd. Cameras flashed, sponsors smiled, and Jonathan tried to act as though his world hadn't just imploded. He gave a brief speech, accepting the applause with a hollow nod of thanks. Internally, all he could think about were Megan's frightened eyes and the possibility that those children were his. When the ceremony finished, he wasted no time slipping away to search for any sign of Megan in the building. But the foyer was crowded with guests wrapping up the event, and she was nowhere to be found. Growing more uneasy by the second, he ducked outside, scanning the streets for a figure with twin girls in tow. People bustled by, most wearing expensive suits or elegant dresses. No Megan, no daughters. He tried calling the number she had used years ago, only to realize he didn't even know if it was still hers. It rang into oblivion. The only hope he had was the slip of paper he'd given her. If she really wanted to reach him, she could. Restless and unsettled, he stood at the edge of the curb, cars rolling past, sponsors stepping into limousines. A cold wind rattled the streetlights overhead. He told himself to wait another few minutes, just in case she reappeared. But as time dragged on, it became clear she wasn't coming back. He couldn't shake the desperation in her voice, nor could he ignore the words she'd whispered about being paid off. Someone in his orbit had enough sway to make Megan vanish for years. Someone powerful enough to convince her that returning was too dangerous. He started to walk toward his own car, the swirl of city lights and late-night traffic blending around him. As his driver opened the door, an unsettling thought hardened in his mind. If someone had orchestrated Megan's disappearance once, they could do it again. And if those twins were truly his children, then he had a responsibility he couldn't walk away from. Not now, not ever. A taxi pulled up suddenly near the curb. He caught the briefest glimpse of Megan's profile in the back seat, one twin nestled against her, the other peering out the window. She didn't see him, or if she did, she chose not to wave. The taxi's taillights disappeared into the thick city traffic before he could even think to follow. He stood there, heart pounding. All the money in the world, and he felt powerless to keep her from slipping through his fingers again. The streetlight overhead flickered, making him shiver against the night's chill. Questions rattled in his mind. Who had paid her off? Why did they want her gone? And what exactly would they do if she tried to come back into his life? Suddenly, a soft voice startled him. He turned to see Megan behind him on the sidewalk, as if she'd changed her mind at the last second and made the taxi driver stop. She took one fearful look around, then stepped closer, her tone urgent and trembling. The twins stayed inside the cab, watching their mother through the open door. "You have no idea who's behind this, but I can't let them hurt my girls again." Jonathan hurried across the parking lot, heart pounding as he scanned the rows of cars for any sign of Megan. The chilly night air bit at his face, and a few stray leaves skittered across the asphalt. Moments ago, he had seen her slip away, Fear etched in her features as she warned him about the danger lurking in his own circle. Now she was gone, and only the clamor of departing guests remained. He rubbed his temples, weighed down by a realization that something far bigger than he'd ever imagined was unfolding. "Mr. Turner," a familiar voice called. He turned to see Grace, her eyes full of concern. "I've been looking everywhere for you. Are you all right?" He hesitated, recalling Megan's trembling words. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "She left with the girls. I tried to follow, but she vanished into a cab. I need to find them." Grace nodded, her calm composure unwavering. "I've been making calls. There's a shelter downtown that provides short-term stays for mothers with children. I know the manager there. If Megan's in a difficult spot, there's a chance that's where she might show up." "Let's go," Jonathan said, ignoring the chill that seeped into his suit. Exhaustion tugged at him, but he couldn't rest until he knew Megan and the twins were safe. He followed Grace to her car, preferring not to draw attention by using his usual driver. The two of them navigated through late-night traffic until they reached a quieter part of the city where streetlights flickered and sidewalks seemed deserted. The shelter's entrance was a simple metal door with a flickering fluorescent bulb overhead. Inside, soft murmurs echoed off peeling walls. Rows of worn-out chairs lined the waiting area, occupied by weary faces who clutched bags of belongings. Jonathan had visited shelters in the past, but only for quick photo opportunities or philanthropic gestures. Tonight, he saw them through different eyes. A volunteer recognized Grace and offered a tentative smile. "It's good to see you again," she said, passing a quick glance at Jonathan in his expensive suit. "Need something?" "We're looking for a young woman," Grace began, describing Megan's appearance in careful detail. She also mentioned 2 little girls, twins with dark hair and timid expressions. The volunteer's face lit with recognition. "They came by earlier in the week, but I haven't seen them tonight. Megan never stays long. She's scared, always glancing over her shoulder." Jonathan stepped forward. "If you see her again, please give her this." He scribbled his personal number on a scrap of paper. "Tell her Jonathan Turner wants to help." The volunteer promised to pass along the message. Outside, the night air pressed in and Jonathan felt a hollow ache in his chest. The possibility that Megan was wandering the streets with no secure place to sleep filled him with a protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. The next morning, he was jolted awake by a persistent ringtone. He had fallen asleep on the sofa in his penthouse, still in half-rumpled clothes from the night before. Grace's voice crackled through the call, reminding him of a scheduled board meeting in less than an hour. The upcoming merger was on a razor's edge, and tensions were already high. He rushed through a shower, mind spinning. By the time he walked into the executive conference room, the atmosphere felt thick with impatience. Several partners eyed him warily, no doubt having heard rumors of the mysterious homeless woman he'd defended at the charity event. One senior partner cleared his throat as soon as Jonathan took his seat. "Jonathan, we need to address the merger's timeline," the partner said, his voice strained. "We can't afford any hiccups, especially scandals that distract from the company's image." Another board member, older and more severe, tapped the table with a manicured nail. "We've heard talk," she said carefully. "Something about a personal situation that could cause unwelcome attention. Investors are jumpy. Are you prepared to keep your private affairs out of the headlines?" Jonathan set his jaw, feeling a flare of anger but keeping his voice steady. "I'm well aware of what's at stake," he said. "Let me handle it. The merger will proceed as planned." Eyes flicked among the executives, and a silent agreement settled that they wouldn't press further, for now. But as the meeting moved on, Jonathan sensed an undercurrent of unease. Once these people had respected him without question. Now they seemed to watch him, prepared to pounce on any sign of vulnerability. He thought of Megan's warning, of the possibility that someone in his own ranks had paid her off to disappear. A cold knot formed in his gut. After the meeting, a senior partner pulled him aside, voice low. You've built a formidable reputation, Jonathan. Don't throw it away for a questionable connection to your past. Investors won't tolerate controversy." Their words sounded almost like a threat, and Jonathan kept his face impassive. Once he escaped to his office, his phone rang again, but this time the caller ID flashed a number he hadn't seen in years, his father's personal line. He answered, heart pounding. A curt greeting came through. "Son, I'm hearing ridiculous rumors about some woman, an ex-girlfriend from your college days. I hope you won't let these distractions derail the biggest deal of your life." Jonathan gritted his teeth. His father had always been blunt, though rarely so dismissive. "You don't know the whole story," he replied, voice tight. His father's scoff echoed over the line. "I know enough. This Megan, or whatever her name is, will vanish once she realizes you won't entertain her games. Don't waste your time or resources on someone who clearly doesn't belong in our circle." Memories surged, unbidden. A younger Jonathan arguing with his father over Megan's background, defending her dreams and sincerity. He could still feel the sting of those disapproving looks, the tension that had driven a wedge between them. Now, years later, it was all coming back. He hung up, mind spinning with anger and suspicion. By midday, Grace notified him that an old friend from college had called, saying something about hush money rumors from back then. Jonathan seized on the lead, returning the call immediately. The friend explained that Megan had suddenly dropped out of sight right before graduation. There'd been whispers of a large payout, but no one seemed to know details. Jonathan remembered trying to reach Megan 100 times, only to be met with silence. Late that evening, after the offices had grown quiet, Jonathan locked himself in his study and dug out a heavy box from a storage closet. Inside lay letters he'd once written to Megan, returned unopened, along with photos of them together in happier days. The last one was dated just 2 weeks before her disappearance. She'd looked carefree, eyes alight with possibilities. Guilt and longing swirled through him. How had everything turned so dark? He startled at the buzz of his phone. Grace's voice came through, hushed with excitement. "Jonathan, I found her. Megan is at a small roadside motel on the outskirts of the city. I'm texting you the address." He wasted no time, grabbing his keys and heading out. The motel stood near a flickering neon sign, surrounded by a cracked parking lot. A few solitary cars dotted the spaces. Jonathan found the number Grace had given him and approached the door, heart pounding. He heard muffled noises inside, children's voices maybe, and he knocked gently. "Who is it?" Megan's voice sounded wary. "It's me," he said, keeping his tone low. "Megan, let me in. I just want to talk." A pause, then, "Go away, Jonathan. We're fine on our own." He rested a hand on the doorframe. "You don't have to trust me, but at least listen to what I have to say." Several moments passed before the old lock rattled. Megan cracked the door open enough to peer out, eyes rimmed with tired defiance. The faint smell of stale air drifted from inside. For a tense second, they locked eyes. Then she opened the door, letting him step past the threshold. It was a single cramped room with peeling wallpaper and a single bed, where the twins sat quietly, their legs drawn in. A chipped table held a few groceries in plastic bags. It struck him how precarious their lives looked, constantly on the move, no security, no comfort. "What do you want?" Megan's voice was brittle. "You have your answers. I left. I stayed away. Isn't that what your people wanted?" He glanced at the twins, who watched with a mixture of caution and curiosity. Trying to keep his voice calm, he said, "I don't know who my people are, but I'm starting to suspect someone very close to me arranged for you to disappear. I never agreed to that." His gaze roamed the small space. "And you shouldn't be living like this." Megan's anger flickered across her features. "Oh, really? And how am I supposed to believe you? All I have is this." She reached into a worn bag on the floor and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It bore a faint watermark and a fancy letterhead, though age had yellowed the edges. This is the only proof I kept. Everything else I trashed a long time ago out of fear." She thrust it toward him. He unfolded it carefully. Even in the dim light, he recognized the familiar, ornate stationery that made his pulse spike. A few lines spelled out the terms of her silence, a sum of money with a clear instruction never to contact him again. Below that, a signature. Jonathan's fingers trembled as he read, blood thundering in his ears. He looked up, eyes full of shock and betrayal. "This is my father's signature." Megan's expression hardened. "Now do you see why I couldn't just come waltzing back? He and whoever else is involved made it clear they'd destroy me if I tried." Jonathan's face went pale as the weight of the letter hit him. It was undeniable proof that his own family had orchestrated Megan's absence. He turned to glance at the twins, realizing in that moment just how deeply his entire world was entangled in secrets. He held the letter, staring at the recognizable stationery. A dark realization settled over him that his father, and maybe others, had spun a web of lies to keep Megan away for years. Jonathan stared at the damning letter in his hand for several moments, scarcely breathing as his father's signature glared up at him from the faded stationery. The motel's dim glow lent an eerie cast to the paper, and it struck him that every single memory he cherished from his youth had been corroded by the truth contained in those lines. Megan stood nearby, arms folded protectively across her chest, the twins peeking out from behind her in anxious silence. The betrayal he felt simmered into something hot and angry, and he knew he needed answers, no matter the cost. He handed the letter back to Megan, a resolute gleam in his eyes. "I won't let them get away with this," he said, voice trembling with emotion. "I promise you." Megan cast him a wary look, as if she'd been burned by that same promise years before. "Words won't fix anything," she replied quietly. "I've had enough empty assurances from people in your circle." He wanted to argue, but the conviction in her voice stopped him. Instead, he inclined his head in a small nod. "Stay here," he said gently. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone else tonight." She didn't ask where he was going, but her gaze flicked nervously to the window. "Please be careful," she whispered. Her tone hinted that she knew confronting a powerful family wouldn't come without risk. Jonathan slipped out into the night. The air smelled faintly of car exhaust and damp concrete, and a lone street lamp buzzed near the worn motel sign. He got into his car and drove with steely determination across the city, heading for his parents' estate. If he didn't address this head-on, he would only be letting them prolong the damage they'd already done. By the time he pulled up to the grand iron gates that led to his childhood home, the sky was a deep navy scattered with faint stars. The gates creaked open under the watchful eye of a late-shift security guard who recognized the family car but looked perplexed at Jonathan's arrival so late. He navigated the curved driveway, memories flashing of simpler times when his father would stand on the mansion steps, welcoming him home from summer camps or business trips with a proud smile. Now, the mansion's facade seemed cold and foreboding. He threw open the heavy front door without bothering to knock. The marble foyer glowed under chandeliers, and somewhere deeper in the house he heard voices. He followed them until he found his father in a spacious living room lined with stately bookshelves. The man stood by the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back. His mother, wearing a silk robe, sat on a nearby settee, looking alarmed by Jonathan's sudden entrance. "Jonathan," his father said in an even tone, "to what do we owe this late visit?" Without preamble, Jonathan pulled the letter from his inside pocket and slammed it onto a polished table. "Explain this," he said, voice raw with betrayal. "Explain why your signature is on a document paying Megan off to vanish from my life." His mother gasped softly, drawing her robe tighter. His father's face tightened, a flicker of discomfort crossing his features. "So you've seen it," he said, inching toward the paper as if it might bite him. "That's all you have to say?" Jonathan demanded. You ruin my chance at a family, hide my own children from me, and now you act as though it's some minor inconvenience?" His father's composure cracked, though his voice remained low. "We did what we had to do to protect you." "Protect me from what?" Jonathan shot back, anger boiling. "From someone I loved? Someone who never did me any harm? You caused unimaginable damage, not just to me, but to Megan, and to our daughters." The last word escaped like a breath he'd been holding forever. His father flinched, confirming that he'd known all along who the children were. Jonathan's mother stood, setting a trembling hand on her husband's shoulder. "Jonathan, we had to make sure you had a future," she said, her voice subdued. "The family business, your reputation. You wouldn't be where you are now if you'd been tied down by a—" "Don't you finish that sentence," Jonathan cut in, eyes flashing. "We both know you underestimated Megan. I built everything I have on my own merit, not because you paid off the mother of my children to disappear." His father exhaled slowly, stepping closer. "And what if that future had been jeopardized by scandal? We had to ensure your position in society was secure. The arrangement was supposed to give Megan a fresh start somewhere else, with enough money to keep her comfortable." Jonathan fought the urge to shout. "Comfortable?" The memory of Megan's shabby motel room and the look of exhaustion on the twins' faces seared his thoughts. She's barely scraping by, afraid for her life and the lives of those little girls. Where was your sense of responsibility while they were living on the streets? His father's expression darkened. "We sent her the money. If she misused it or—" Jonathan shook his head fiercely. "Enough. You may have power in the boardroom, but you had no right to decide who I love or how I live." He slammed his fist on the table. "You turned me into a stranger to my own kids." A tense silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the fireplace. Jonathan could see guilt warring with pride on his mother's face. She reached out a trembling hand, but he drew back. "I can't look at either of you right now," he said, voice thick. "I need to go." He left the letter on the table, refusing to give them the chance to pretend it didn't exist. As he marched through the foyer toward the door, he heard his father call after him. "If you choose Megan over us, don't expect this family or the board to shield you from the consequences." Jonathan spun around. "I'm not asking you to shield me. In fact, from what I've seen, you're exactly who I need shielding from." He stormed outside, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The night air felt like a slap of cold reality. He climbed into his car and revved the engine, the family mansion shrinking in his rearview mirror. The conversation replayed in his head, leaving a sickening weight in his chest. But despite the fury and sadness, a new resolve stirred in him. If his own father had orchestrated Megan's disappearance, then who else might have been involved? He couldn't let them keep wielding that power. By the time he returned to the motel, dawn was edging over the horizon, painting the sky with pale streaks of lavender. He found Megan in the small room, zipping up the last of her bags. The twins sat on the bed, eyes swollen from interrupted sleep. "I'm leaving," Megan said, not meeting his gaze. "You don't understand the lengths these people will go to in order to maintain control. They've already shown me once." Jonathan raised his palms, his voice gentle. "I spoke with them. It didn't go well. But please hear me out before you go." She paused, rummaging through her bag for a moment. "I trusted you once, and look where it got me." "I know," he said, heartbreak thrumming in every word. "I was in the dark too, but that doesn't make your pain any less real. I want to help, Megan. I need to protect you and the girls." Her eyes flashed with lingering anger. "How, Jonathan? By throwing money at the problem? That's all anyone in your family does." "No," he said earnestly. "I'm not my father. I'm not the board. I can find a safer place for you, somewhere these people can't reach so easily. Let me do at least that much." She stared at him, as if weighing the sincerity in his voice against all the memories of betrayal. The twins exchanged a nervous glance. Finally, Megan sat on the edge of the bed, covering her face with her hands. "I'm so tired of running," she whispered, and tears escaped down her cheeks. Jonathan's heart ached. He carefully set a small set of groceries Grace had brought on the rickety table: milk, bread, fruit. The sight of it brought a faint smile to one of the girls who eagerly reached for an apple. Megan looked at the simple offering as if it represented a fragile promise. "Mama, can we stay?" asked one of the twins, her voice soft with hope. Megan brushed away her tears. She nodded slowly, meeting Jonathan's gaze. "Okay, but if I sense we're in danger, I'm gone. Don't think I won't." He swallowed, relief mixing with determination. "We'll take it day by day. First step is getting you out of this motel." He glanced at the peeling wallpaper and the drafty window. "I have a discreet townhouse not far from here. You can stay there while we figure out our next move." As they gathered their meager belongings, Jonathan couldn't help but feel the weight of invisible eyes. The same feeling made the hairs on his neck stand upright when they stepped into the parking lot, where a rusted sedan idled at the far end. Its headlights clicked on as soon as they emerged, and Megan stiffened. "Do you know that car?" Jonathan asked, voice low. She nodded grimly. "I've seen it before. They've been following us." Within seconds, a man stepped out of the vehicle, his silhouette barely illuminated by the rising sun. He moved toward Megan with a calculated, menacing stride. Jonathan shoved the duffel bags into his trunk and told Megan to get in the car with the twins. Then he turned to face the stranger, tension crackling in the air. "You're meddling in business that's none of yours," the man said, voice cold. "If you know what's best, you'll walk away right now." Jonathan squared his shoulders. "These are my children, and Megan's not going anywhere unless she wants to." The man raised an eyebrow, letting out a short, mocking laugh. "Your father's people don't see it that way. Do yourself a favor and back off before you lose everything you've built." That was all Jonathan needed to hear. Fury coursed through him, and he clenched his fists, ready to defend Megan and the twins. "Get out of here," he growled. "If I see you again, we'll let the police settle this." The man leaned in, face twisting with contempt. "Keep pushing, Turner. You'll see how disposable you really are." Then he got back in his sedan and sped off, tires squealing on the cracked pavement. Jonathan hurried back to his car, where Megan and the twins huddled in anxious silence. He slid behind the wheel, taking a trembling breath. "We're going to the townhouse," he said, forcing a calm he didn't entirely feel. He reached out and touched Megan's hand for a brief moment. She didn't pull away, but her eyes were clouded with fear. They drove through quiet streets until they reached a modest residential area shielded by tall trees. The townhouse, while far from grand, was a significant step up from the motel. He led them inside, double-checking the locks on the doors. The twins wandered into the living room, marveling at the neat furniture and soft rugs. Megan stood in the entryway, hugging her arms around herself. "I can't believe I'm here," she said quietly, glancing at Jonathan. "Part of me wants to run, and part of me wants to see if this could actually be normal." Jonathan nodded, understanding the conflict in her voice all too well. "You won't have to run alone," he replied. "Not anymore." They unpacked enough to settle for the night, though everyone was on edge. Megan peeked through the curtains, still worried the sedan might appear again. Jonathan assured her they'd have private security check the perimeter. Evening arrived with a heavy sense of relief that they had made it this far without another confrontation. As the twins fell asleep on a pull-out couch, Megan allowed Jonathan to sit beside her. She was still guarded, her shoulders tense. Yet when he gently laid a blanket over the girls, she gave him a small, grateful smile. For the first time, there was a hint of trust in her eyes, fragile but real. He rose to his feet. "Get some rest," he said softly. "We'll talk about next steps in the morning." Megan nodded. "Thank you for everything." Jonathan lingered for a moment, watching the soft rise and fall of the twins' breathing, then slipped into a small guest room. He was exhausted, but his thoughts wouldn't settle. He remembered his father's parting threat, the menacing stranger at the motel, and the unsettling knowledge that the conspiracy ran deep. He vowed to fight it, no matter how powerful the people involved might be. Just as he was about to close his eyes, his phone buzzed. A single text message from an unknown number glowed on the screen. His pulse quickened as he read the ominous words, "You have too much to lose. Walk away, or suffer the consequences." Jonathan woke from a fitful sleep before dawn, the menacing glow of his phone's screen still burning into his thoughts. The text message he'd received, "You have too much to lose. Walk away, or suffer the consequences," refused to leave his mind. He sat up on the narrow guest room bed, exhaling slowly as he tried to gather himself. There wasn't time for fear. He had too much at stake now. Brushing off the lingering dread, he rose, checked on Megan and the twins, and then called Grace. When she answered, he read her the anonymous threat in a low voice, pacing the small room. "Whoever it is," he said, "they're not bluffing. I need to make sure Megan and the girls aren't caught in the crossfire." Grace, calm as ever, promised to bolster security. "I can have a private team rotate shifts around the townhouse," she offered. "But you and I both know the minute your name hits the tabloids, they'll find out where you've placed her." Jonathan sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I know. That's why I want them to stay here, under the radar, until we figure out who's behind the threats and keep the press from making this worse." Once dawn lightened the sky, he ended the call. In the living room, he found the twins curled on the couch, still fast asleep. Megan, however, was wide awake in the small kitchen area, a mug of tea in her hands. Dark shadows under her eyes betrayed how little rest she'd had. She looked at him warily. "Bad news?" she asked, motioning toward the phone in his hand. He shrugged, trying to appear more confident than he felt. "Just sorting some details," he murmured. "For now, it's best we stay out of sight. How are the girls?" Megan's eyes flicked to the twins. "They slept through the night, which is more than we usually get," she admitted, then turned back to him. "Thank you for letting us stay here." He recognized the effort it took for her to say those words. She'd run her own life independently for so long. "It's the least I can do," he said. "I don't want you on the streets, especially not now." Before either of them could delve further, the television in the corner glowed to life. Its volume was low, but the morning news showed a headline: "Billionaire CEO under fire amid paternity rumors." Jonathan's shoulders tensed. He leaned closer, reading the scrolling text. It mentioned an unidentified woman with twin children, hinting that Jonathan might be the father. Megan watched, her expression shifting from curiosity to alarm. "Is that about us?" she asked, her grip tightening around the mug. Jonathan set his jaw. "I'm afraid so. Word travels fast in my world, and the media will jump on any scandal." Megan took a trembling breath. "They'll never leave me or the twins alone, will they?" He wanted to reassure her, but he refused to make promises he couldn't keep. "I'll do everything I can to shield you," he said, "but we can't control what they print. We just have to manage the situation so it does the least harm." The soft click of a door announced the twins' presence. One of the girls rubbed her eyes, glancing at the muted TV. "Mommy?" she asked in a small, uncertain voice. "Are they talking about us?" Megan placed a gentle hand on the child's shoulder. "No, sweetheart," she said. "Just grown-up talk. Go see if you can find some cereal, okay?" Jonathan forced a comforting smile as the girl wandered into the kitchen, brightening at the sight of a carton of milk and a box of cereal on the counter. Meanwhile, inside him, dread took root. This coverage would only intensify. He'd known it the moment he chose to stand by Megan rather than distance himself. A message from Grace flashed on his phone, reminding him about an emergency board meeting. He told Megan he had to handle some business and assured her the new security detail would arrive shortly. "Please trust me," he said quietly. "I'll be back." She nodded, though her eyes conveyed clear worry and a lingering question. How can I trust you when everything around us is falling apart? He only managed a faint, apologetic smile before slipping out. An hour later, he stood in a sleek conference room downtown, polished floors and glass walls reflecting the frantic faces of board members. The tension was palpable. All eyes snapped to Jonathan the moment he walked in. "We can't afford negative press," one partner barked, fingers tapping impatiently on the glossy table. "This merger hinges on public perception, and we're already seeing fallout on social media." Jonathan clenched his jaw. "I'm handling it," he said. Another member, older and grayer, eyed Jonathan with thinly veiled hostility. "There's talk of scandal, talk of children. If you're hiding a family, it looks deceitful to investors. We've spent millions portraying you as the wholesome face of this company." Jonathan breathed in slowly, forcing composure. "There's no official proof of anything, just rumors." A middle-aged woman in a crisp suit checked her phone. "Rumors that could cost us all. Sponsors are calling. They're already threatening to pull out if you don't clarify the situation." He surveyed the room, noticing how a few allies refused to meet his eye. Even those who'd stood by him in the past seemed nervous, wary of losing their stake. For a moment he recalled Megan's worried face, the twins huddled together on that worn couch. Was he supposed to deny them outright for the sake of a corporate image? "I'm not issuing any statement that abandons my moral responsibility," he said, voice firm. "If some aspects of my personal life come to light, I'll address them privately and ethically. The merger can still go forward, but I won't toss 2 children to the wolves." Silence fell, followed by murmurs. Some board members glanced at each other, uncertain whether they should press him further. Finally, the older man cleared his throat. "All right, we can delay our official response by a day or 2 at most. But Jonathan, if this gets worse, we have to consider your position here." Jonathan merely nodded, a cold sense of finality in his chest. He left the meeting with shoulders stiff and mind racing, ignoring the watchful stares of staff in the hallway. By the time he stepped back into his office, exhaustion dragged at him. Running his hands across his face, he dialed Grace. "How bad is it?" he asked, slumping into his desk chair. She rattled off a few gossip headlines, all speculating on the identity of the homeless woman who'd confronted security at his charity event. "They've got pictures," she added. "Not clear ones of Megan or the twins, but enough to stir the press." He groaned. "This is exactly what I wanted to avoid. How's Megan?" "She's coping," Grace said carefully. "I checked in on them earlier. She seems tense. Overheard part of your phone call about the board meeting. She might think you're only trying to cover your tracks." Jonathan stood abruptly, scanning the large windows overlooking the city skyline. "I'm not. I just can't let these people tear us apart again. I need to show her I'm genuine." Grace paused. "Maybe you should go home, spend some time with them. Show it with actions, not just words." He swallowed, shutting his eyes. "You're right. I'll head back soon." That evening, he carried takeout containers into the townhouse, hoping a warm meal would ease some tensions. Megan sat at the kitchen table, posture guarded, while the twins buzzed around, excited at the prospect of different food. The living room TV was off, which he took as a sign that Megan wanted to avoid the constant news cycle. He started dishing out rice and stir-fry, aware of how normal it felt and how surreal. In the quiet, they all began to eat. One twin asked him shyly if he liked the same cartoons they did. He admitted he hadn't watched cartoons in ages, which drew amused giggles. Megan observed them, a blend of curiosity and caution in her gaze. During a lull in conversation, Megan spoke softly. "I saw the headlines. They're all about you and some secret family. The twins don't fully understand, but they know we're being talked about." Jonathan set down his fork, meeting her eyes. "I'm sorry," he said. "I tried to keep you out of it, but these vultures circle the moment they smell drama." She sighed, glancing at the twins. They were engrossed in picking out broccoli from their plates, oblivious to the seriousness in the room. Then she lowered her voice. "I overheard you on the phone earlier. You said you have to handle this family matter with dignity. It sounded like you were more concerned about your company's image than about us." He leaned forward, quiet urgency in his tone. "I won't lie. The board is on a warpath about this. But that doesn't mean I don't care about you and the girls. I do. More than I've cared about anything in a long time." The honesty in his eyes made her glance away for a second. "I've seen how powerful your family is," she said. "All these years I thought one day I'd come find you, but then I'd remember the threats, the money, the intimidation." She closed her eyes briefly. It's hard to believe there's any safety when you're connected to that world. Gently, he reached across the table to lay his hand atop hers, careful not to alarm her. "I'm not them. My father might have orchestrated everything, but I'm determined to break away from those methods. And if the board wants me gone because I won't disown you, then so be it." A flicker of gratitude passed over her features, though it vanished quickly. "Let's see if you really mean it when it gets tough," she murmured. They finished the meal with the occasional giggle from the girls lightening the mood. Later, as twilight deepened, the twins entertained themselves with a borrowed coloring book. Megan took Jonathan aside, walking to a quiet corner of the living room. "How long can we hide?" she asked, voice hushed. "Reporters will discover this place eventually. Then what?" Jonathan glanced at the drawn blinds. "I'm hiring a private security team," he said. "Until I can sort out who's behind the threats, or at least until I can guarantee you're safe, we keep the profile low. If it gets too dangerous, I'll move you somewhere else, even out of the city if we have to." She looked both relieved and anxious. "Thank you." Her words were cautious, but he sensed a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to believe him. Night settled in, and everyone prepared for bed. The townhouse had 2 small bedrooms, so Jonathan offered one to Megan and the twins while he took the couch. He insisted they deserved a proper room, and though Megan hesitated, the girls' excitement about sharing a real bed won out. After setting up a small nightlight for the twins, Megan tucked them under a blanket. She whispered a gentle goodnight and stepped back to watch them drift off, tiny hands clutching stuffed animals Jonathan had rushed out to buy that afternoon. Across the hallway, Jonathan stood in the soft glow of a lamp, phone in hand. He lingered, eyes flicking between a text from Grace and the secure front door. The message from Grace read, "Board is restless. Expect more pressure tomorrow." He rubbed the back of his neck, resentment curling in his gut. If the board forced him to choose between them and his family, it wouldn't be much of a choice at all. He'd walk away, but that would mean losing everything he'd built. His empire, his influence, his name. Yet every time he recalled Megan's fear and the twins' uncertain eyes, he felt certain it was the right path if it protected them. Megan, standing at the door of the bedroom, heard the muffled ring of his phone and glanced over. Soft shadows played across her features, revealing the conflicting emotions she carried. For a moment, their eyes met. He gave her a small nod, pressing the phone to his ear. As Megan closed the door, she overheard him speak in a determined tone. "I'll do whatever it takes. No one will threaten my family again." She froze, one hand still on the doorknob, thinking how fierce he sounded. In her chest, something trembled. She wasn't sure if it was relief or dread, because for all Jonathan's good intentions, she had seen powerful forces crush noble promises before, and she couldn't decide whether to trust his conviction or fear it. Morning light crept through the curtains, a muted glow that roused Megan from a restless sleep. She sat up slowly, drawing the blanket around her shoulders as she listened for any sign of movement in the townhouse. Quiet footsteps approached in the hallway, and she remembered Jonathan's words from the night before. "I'll do whatever it takes. No one will threaten my family again." She wasn't sure if he'd meant the promise as comfort or a pledge to wield his power. The uncertainty gnawed at her. She feared that in Jonathan's world, whatever it takes could blur into manipulation rather than genuine protection. On the other side of the small bedroom, the twins still dozed, curled up under soft blankets they'd never had before. Megan smoothed a strand of hair off one little forehead, feeling the warmth of a child's steady breathing. She wanted to cling to this fragile peace as long as possible. A knock sounded at the door, and Jonathan's voice called through softly, "Megan, you awake?" She pulled on a robe over her pajamas, cracked the door open, and found him in the hallway, balancing a tray with 3 cups of hot chocolate for the twins. His presence filled the space from his tall frame to the faint worry lines etched around his eyes. "The girls might like this," he said with a hesitant smile. Megan managed a nod. "Thanks," she whispered, taking the tray. She paused, studying his face. "Long night?" he exhaled. "I had calls from the security team, then a few urgent messages. There's a lot swirling right now." She had to bite back the urge to ask if he'd discovered who kept sending threats. Instead, she took the tray inside. The moment the twins caught sight of steaming cups dusted with cocoa powder, excited little murmurs broke the morning's hush. She left them giggling, sipping carefully at the hot chocolate, then joined Jonathan in the hall again. He guided her into the small living room, where Grace was waiting with a serious expression. "Tabloids are pushing the angle of a secret family," Grace said, showing them her phone. Headlines scrolled across the screen, all featuring Jonathan's name in bold. Some paragraphs hinted about Megan's identity, though none had official proof. Still, the pictures were grainy enough that the press had begun spinning an entire narrative. Megan's stomach twisted as she spotted a photo from the charity event. It was blurry, but anyone who knew her might recognize her. "Great," she muttered, crossing her arms. "They'll hound us no matter where we go." Jonathan set his jaw. "Let's see what they publish. I'm refusing to give any personal details, so all they have are rumors." He glanced at Grace. "Draft a press statement acknowledging nothing. We won't confirm or deny specifics." Grace nodded. "That's what I thought. Just keep it vague. Say you're dealing with a private matter." Megan let out a short laugh. "That won't stop the media frenzy." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I know. But it's the best way to shield you and the twins for now." Any further debate was interrupted by the sudden buzz of Jonathan's phone. A grimace flickered across his face when he saw the caller ID. "It's my father," he muttered, stepping into a corner of the living room to take the call. Megan watched the tension in his shoulders grow as he spoke in hushed tones. Though she couldn't hear the other side, she caught fragments of Jonathan's replies. "I'm handling it," and "Stop meddling, please." The final words were sharper. "No, I'm not going to abandon them," he said, gripping the phone tightly before cutting the call short. He returned to the center of the room, knuckles whitening. "He claims he only meant to protect me, but now he's hinting I'm throwing everything away." A bitter laugh escaped him. "That's rich, coming from a man who paid off the mother of my children to vanish." A flash of sympathy in Grace's eyes suggested she had overheard a portion of that conversation. Megan could only imagine the manipulations swirling behind the scenes. Jonathan might truly want to help, but he was still deeply embedded in a world where power meant secrets and deals in the shadows. She stepped away to breathe, rummaging through her small suitcase to find her old phone. She rarely turned it on, but curiosity gnawed at her. Sure enough, as soon as the battered device powered up, notifications appeared. A grainy photo of Megan and the twins was circulating online, accompanied by guesses that the mysterious beggar was Jonathan's ex-lover. Her stomach dropped. She scrolled further, seeing vile comments blaming her for wanting a slice of Jonathan's fortune or claiming she'd trapped him. "People are disgusting," she whispered, snapping the phone shut. She went to the kitchen for a glass of water, fighting the urge to smash the phone altogether. Jonathan followed her, lingering by the counter. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. This is the last thing I wanted." She could sense his guilt, but she remained guarded. "It's not your fault," she admitted. "It's your world that chews people up and spits them out if they don't fit the mold." Before Jonathan could respond, a tentative knock sounded at the door. Grace rushed to answer it, eyeing the security camera feed on her phone. When she opened the door, a slim, neatly dressed man stood outside, briefcase in hand. "I'm here on behalf of certain members of the Turner Enterprises board," he announced in a clipped tone, leaning forward to peer in. "I need to speak with Mr. Turner and Ms. Megan. I believe that's her name?" Alarm rippled through Megan, and Jonathan immediately stepped into the narrow entry. "We don't take uninvited visitors," he said, voice frosty. "Who are you?" The man offered a tight smile. "I'm an attorney. I've been authorized to present Ms. Megan with a financial offer so she can move on from this situation peacefully." "What?" Megan blurted, stepping forward despite her better judgment. "Another bribe to disappear?" The attorney's smile didn't reach his eyes. "It's a settlement. A recognition that if any children exist, you could benefit from support. But we all know how detrimental a scandal could be for Mr. Turner's standing." Jonathan snapped, "We're done here," and tried to shut the door. But the lawyer stuck his briefcase forward, blocking it. "I recommend hearing me out," he said. "The board wants to avoid a messy public situation. They're prepared to be more than generous if Ms. Megan agrees to sign a non-disclosure agreement and keep the twins out of the spotlight." Megan's cheeks burned with outrage, old wounds reopening at the memory of how she'd once taken hush money to ensure Jonathan never found out about their children. She shoved the door further, forcing the man to stumble back. "We're not interested. Get off this property." Jonathan's eyes flashed, and he pressed the door hard, slamming it shut in the lawyer's face. A jolt of finality echoed through the townhouse as the bolt clicked. Megan's heart pounded. She found herself almost shaking with anger. "They really think I'll just vanish again if they wave enough money in front of me?" Jonathan tried to steady his own breathing. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. They won't quit until you're out of the picture. They want me to stand alone, squeaky clean, no complications." She took a step back, her voice thick with bitterness. "And how many times have you told me you'd protect us? Seems like every corner we turn, there's someone else trying to buy our silence or threaten us." A flicker of hurt crossed his face, but he didn't deny it. "I don't blame you for doubting me," he said. "All I can do is prove I'm on your side." She scoffed softly, hugging her arms around herself. "I've heard this before, Jonathan." The tension hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. In the living room, the twins hovered by the couch, wide-eyed. One of them clutched a small stuffed animal as if it could guard her from the swirling chaos outside. Megan's anger deflated into guilt at the sight of them. She knelt, trying to smile reassuringly, as Jonathan joined her. "Hey," he said gently to the girls, "how about we read a story before bed tonight? I saw that book we picked up yesterday. Maybe we can see what adventures are in there." Their faces lit up with subdued excitement, a distraction from the tension. Megan nodded, letting him lead them to the sofa. He cleared his throat, opening the children's book with illustrations of whimsical animals. For a few minutes, the townhouse filled with the soft sound of Jonathan's reading and the girls' occasional giggles. Megan watched from a short distance, her chest tight with conflicting emotions. The man who once seemed unreachable now read bedtime tales to children he'd barely met, bringing them comfort. In that moment, she believed he meant every word about standing by them, even if she couldn't shake the feeling that his wealthy, powerful world would never let them find real peace. Later that evening, the phone rang again, one of the lines Jonathan used for business. He took the call in the kitchen, tension marring his face. Megan hovered nearby, only catching fragments. "You can't expect me to solve this overnight," he said, gripping the edge of the counter. "I understand the stakes. Yes, I know the investors are rattled." His voice dropped, and she could see him pressing his fingertips to his eyes in frustration. Eventually, he ended the call with a curt, "I'll handle it," and set the phone down heavily. "What happened?" Megan asked, bracing for more bad news. His chest rose and fell with a long breath. "A major investor's threatening to pull out if I don't publicly clarify this family scandal. They're basically demanding I prove there's no breach of trust, or I hand over my controlling shares to them." She felt a chill settle in the room, an echo of what had happened years ago. "So, they want you to sign me and the girls off as a mistake you're rectifying?" He raked a hand through his hair, anger flickering in his eyes. "I'm not doing that. But if I don't play along with them, they could force me out of my own company, freeze my assets, shut me out, everything." Megan leaned against the wall, the weight of his words pressing in. Is that really possible?" "Yes," he admitted quietly. "I built the company, but the board and the investors can push for a change in leadership if they think I'm a liability, and if they decide to freeze assets, I won't even be able to pay for security or basic needs here." Fear flitted across her features. She'd lived on the edge before, scraping by, but losing everything. "Then what do we do?" she whispered. Jonathan didn't have an easy answer. He stared at the silent phone for a long moment, then turned to her, voice hollow. "They'll take everything from me. From us. If I don't play their game." Megan looked at him, unsure if he'd betray her again or finally stand up against his own empire. Jonathan woke before the sun rose, heart pounding with the memory of last night's threat from the investors. For a moment he lay there on the sofa, staring at the dim ceiling, replaying every conversation in his mind. His own company was on the verge of turning against him, and the family that once claimed to protect him had been behind the very bribe that drove Megan away. The weight of it all pressed down on his chest, making him feel as though the walls were closing in. He got up quietly, not wanting to disturb Megan or the twins. The townhouse felt unnaturally still, the silence frayed by the tension that had built since they moved in. Outside the kitchen window, the sky was barely tinged with the faintest purple. He made himself coffee, nursing it in slow sips as he paced between the living room and the kitchen, trying to plan his next move. Grace arrived a little after dawn, letting herself in with a key Jonathan had provided. She handed him a folder stuffed with papers. "Documents you need to see," she said in a hushed tone. "Bank transactions from years ago, around the time Megan vanished." He opened the folder on the kitchen table, scanning the sheets. There were large withdrawals, questionable deposits, and coded entries that appeared to funnel money into anonymous accounts. Each line seemed to rattle him further. A swirl of anger churned in his gut. These transactions had names tied to them, names of board members he'd trusted. Grace lowered her voice. "I think you already suspected this, but these records confirm that certain partners colluded with your father. They wanted Megan gone. The payments were disguised as consultancy fees." Jonathan grimaced, sliding his hand across his jaw. "So it wasn't just my father. Others were involved. This changes everything." Megan emerged, softly closing the bedroom door behind her so as not to wake the twins. She saw the papers spread across the table and the grim set of Jonathan's jaw. "What's going on?" she asked, arms folded protectively over her chest. He gestured for her to look at the documents. Proof that the board wasn't just complicit. They helped orchestrate everything. She pressed her lips together, reading the incriminating lines in silence. When she set the folder down, her eyes glistened with a fresh wave of hurt. "I spent so many years thinking it was just your father pulling the strings. But there were more people behind it, all with enough power to crush anyone who doesn't fit their plan." A mixture of rage and guilt surged through him. "I'm sorry," he said again, feeling the words were woefully inadequate. "I never wanted you to go through that alone." Before he could say more, the twins trotted out from the bedroom, rubbing the sleep from their eyes. Megan quickly tucked the papers aside, managing a tight smile for the girls. Grace also drew back, giving them room. Jonathan ruffled the children's hair, offering them a gentle "Morning, ladies," and ushered them to the kitchen so they could have breakfast in peace. Once the girls were settled, Megan and Jonathan stepped into the living room. She could barely contain her apprehension. "You know they're not going to let us expose them," she said. "They'll tear you apart first, then come after me. I've seen what they can do." Jonathan nodded, voice soft but resolute. "I'd rather fight them than let them manipulate me again. I can't live with myself if I stay silent." Before she could respond, his phone vibrated. An old friend from college, a lawyer he trusted, was calling. Jonathan put it on speaker, and the friend confirmed the rumors. Hush money had indeed circulated at the time Megan vanished, and the talk was that the board had orchestrated it to secure Jonathan's future alliances with bigger investors. "Look," his friend said, "some folks who were there remember you fighting with your father. Then Megan disappeared. The rest of us never really knew why. But it seems like half the board pushed the plan, and the other half turned a blind eye." Jonathan exchanged a troubled glance with Megan as he ended the call. Each new piece of information only deepened the betrayal. Later that morning, he decided to confront one of those board members rumored to have orchestrated the biggest bribes. Grace arranged a discreet meeting at a high-end restaurant downtown, one that opened early for exclusive patrons. Jonathan parked behind the building, praying no paparazzi had followed him. If the press caught wind of a confrontation, the blowback could be swift. Inside, the restaurant was hushed, tables spaced wide for privacy. The partner, a gray-haired, impeccably dressed man who had once given Jonathan fatherly advice, already sipped espresso at a corner table. He barely acknowledged Jonathan's arrival. When Jonathan sat, the partner glanced at him with cool eyes. "You want to talk about old accounts?" he said. "I assume you've come to your senses?" Jonathan laid a copy of the suspicious transactions on the table. "These are your signatures. You helped pay Megan off. You also intimidated her into staying silent. Care to explain?" The man shrugged. "Your father led the charge. I simply oversaw the legalities. We believed it was in the company's best interest to keep your focus on business." Jonathan's stomach twisted with revulsion. "You had no right to interfere in my life." A flash of annoyance crossed the partner's face. "I gave you the future you have now, wealth, a powerful network, influence. You should be thanking us." He finished his espresso and set the cup down with a clink. "If you go digging around in this old mess, you'll only hurt yourself. And if you threaten to reveal certain truths, the board will do whatever it must to protect the company." Jonathan's anger sparked, but he held himself in check, lowering his voice so it wouldn't carry to the staff. "You're threatening me, and you're threatening Megan. I won't let that stand." The partner pushed his chair back, the legs scraping the polished floor. "Consider your choices carefully. If you ruin us, you also ruin yourself." He slid his coat on, then paused. "Or, you can do what's best for everyone. Cut ties with that woman. The board will forget this conversation, and you'll keep your seat." He left without waiting for an answer, the faint tap of his dress shoes echoing. Jonathan watched him go, blood pounding in his ears. The conversation crystallized everything. His father, the board, none of them planned to atone for the damage they'd done. They were more concerned with preserving their power than admitting the harm they'd caused Megan and her daughters. He rushed back to the townhouse, ignoring the frantic calls from reporters who had likely noticed him leaving the restaurant. When he stepped inside, Megan was near the window, peeking through the blinds. Her posture screamed tension. She turned at the sound of the door closing, relief washing over her features when she saw it was him. He told her about the meeting, omitting no details. Her face paled as he relayed the partner's cold, dismissive words. "So they've got you cornered," she murmured. "They can force you out and make you lose everything if you don't abandon us." Jonathan took her hands. "I'm not leaving you. I'd walk away from the company first. But that doesn't mean I won't fight to expose them. They think they can keep doing this to people, paying them off or threatening them into silence." A tremor of rage shook his voice. "No more," she nodded. though he sensed her fear. "Just be careful," she said, voice trembling. "I've been running for so long, I don't know how to face them head-on. But I'm tired of being afraid." He brushed a thumb against her cheek, surprised by his own surge of protectiveness. "We'll face them together." In the days that followed, Megan's anxiety built. She watched the twins closely, jumping at any unusual noise outside the townhouse. More than once, Jonathan found her sitting with a suitcase half-packed, clearly torn between flight and the fragile trust she was placing in him. He never tried to stop her from packing. He only reminded her she didn't have to run anymore if she didn't want to. Meanwhile, he gathered every scrap of evidence Grace could dig up. Document after document revealed a tangled conspiracy involving not just his father, but multiple board members who had used the hush money to protect the company's merger opportunities over the years. Bribes, blackmail, everything was coming to light. He realized these people hadn't just targeted Megan, they had systematically removed obstacles to ensure their iron grip on the business. One afternoon, Grace arrived with new files. She also brought a grim look. "Jonathan, if you go public with all this," she said quietly, "the blowback might be more severe than losing your job. These people don't play fair." He set his jaw, glancing at Megan, who listened from across the room, arms folded. "I'm not letting them bury the truth anymore," he said, "even if it destroys me. It's time everyone knows how far they've gone." Megan stood, crossing the room to lay a hand on his arm. "I don't want you to risk everything because of me and the girls," she said softly, searching his eyes. "We've managed so far. We could keep hiding." He turned to her, voice firm but compassionate. "I won't let them destroy you again, or keep me from my daughters." Then he breathed in, shoulders square. "I'm calling a press conference. I'll gather my allies on the board, present these documents, and force the issue into the open." Megan looked stunned, possibly terrified, but she didn't stop him. Grace stood by his side, phone in hand, ready to make the calls to a few journalists who still believed in ethical reporting. Jonathan felt a spark of resolve ignite. If he didn't fight now, he'd regret it forever. They set a date 2 days away, enough time to finalize the evidence. Jonathan scrolled through the files for the 100th time, each damning piece of paper fueling his anger. But behind that anger lay a sense of duty to Megan and the twins. The night before the planned press conference, Jonathan was tidying the living room when Grace's number lit up his phone. He answered, expecting a simple last-minute update, but her urgent tone made him freeze. "You won't believe the signatures I've found," she said breathlessly. "This goes higher than we ever imagined." Jonathan's eyes widened, a chill sweeping through him as he realized their enemy might not only be in his father's circle, but possibly in places he hadn't even begun to suspect. Jonathan stared at the phone in his hand, still reeling from Grace's urgent words the night before, evidence that the conspiracy spread deeper than they had ever guessed. Dawn's early glow filtered through the curtains of the townhouse's living room, illuminating his weary face. Over the past few days, he'd marshaled every ounce of courage to challenge the powerful forces determined to keep Megan and the twins hidden away. Now, it felt as though he stood on the edge of a precipice, about to lose everything in one swift plunge. Megan emerged from the hallway, dark smudges beneath her eyes. She gave him a questioning look, as if bracing for more bad news. Since the moment she and the girls had arrived here, each day brought fresh turmoil, threatening phone calls, ominous letters, the persistent eyes of the press. Neither of them had found a moment's rest. "Did you sleep?" she asked softly, rubbing her arms for warmth. He shook his head. "Too much racing through my mind. Grace found something explosive in those documents." He clenched his jaw. "I was going to announce everything publicly, put the truth out there. But now, it's bigger than we thought." Her gaze flicked to the twins who were still asleep in the bedroom, blissfully unaware for the moment. "So what's your plan?" she asked, voice subdued. "You said you'd fight them." I just hope it doesn't destroy you." He inhaled, swallowing a bitter taste. "If I do nothing, they'll keep pushing until we're in the gutter. If I speak up, they'll come at me with everything. I'll lose the company, maybe even my assets. But it's not like we have many good options left." She nodded, thoughts churning behind her eyes. "Whatever you decide, I won't run. Not this time. I'm sick of being scared." A small, grateful smile tugged at his lips. Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. He braced himself for more unwelcome news. But it was Grace, quietly asking if she could come over. Jonathan agreed and ended the call, trying to steady his nerves. He glanced at Megan, who gave him a nod, and they both set about tidying the place as best they could before Grace's arrival, an attempt to restore some sense of order in a life that felt chaotic. Within an hour, Grace arrived, stepping through the door with careful urgency. She carried a folder thick with documents, her expression a mix of determination and dread. "I tried verifying the signatures one by one," she said, setting the folder on the kitchen table. "It's all real." Jonathan opened the folder. Pages of financial records, wire transfers, and internal memos stared back at him. Some listed the names of powerful executives, not just on his company's board, but in neighboring industries as well. There were correspondences that hinted at hush money being paid to more than one potential problem. As if Megan's story was just one of many, his stomach twisted. "This means my father wasn't acting alone. Half the people who taught me how to run a business were part of the conspiracy." Grace pursed her lips. "I'm so sorry," she said gently. "I know these names must be difficult for you to see." Megan joined them at the table, scanning the pages with a tense frown. She recognized certain signatures from the old letter that forced her away. Jonathan's father, of course, but also other high-ranking figures whose influence stretched beyond a single corporation. "They bribed me to leave you," she murmured, voice trembling. "But I guess they've done the same to anyone else who threatened to rock their perfect image." Jonathan placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Not anymore," he said, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. "We're blowing this wide open." Before long, the twins shuffled into the living room, still in their pajamas. Megan gently guided them to an area where they could play quietly. She didn't want them seeing the mountain of incriminating documents or the grim looks passing among the adults. A cartoon played on low volume, filling the background with cheery music starkly at odds with the storm brewing around them. Grace cleared her throat, her gaze shifting between Megan and Jonathan. "I have to warn you, the board won't just freeze your assets if you do this. They'll drag your name through the mud, and the press will be merciless, especially after those paternity rumors." Jonathan exhaled slowly. "My name is already tarnished. I'd rather it happen because I tried to do what's right than keep living under their thumb." For a moment, Megan studied his expression. Steadfast, fierce. She brushed her fingertips across the back of his hand, a fleeting gesture of support. "If you're willing to stand by me and the girls, I'll back you up," she said quietly. "Just don't let them break you." He squeezed her hand in return. "It's not just about us. All the people these board members have crushed deserve the truth to come out." Yet the vow was scarcely spoken before Jonathan's phone erupted in a shrill ring. The display showed his personal attorney's number. He answered, trying to keep his voice level. Megan's eyes never left him, reading every flicker of his expression. "What do you mean, frozen?" Jonathan snapped, pacing a tight circle in the limited space. He fell silent, listening, fury mounting with each passing second. "They can't do that without a formal vote. Well, have they called a vote behind my back?" Grace and Megan exchanged anxious looks. The twins glanced over, sensing the tension, but Megan offered them a reassuring smile before ushering them back to the cartoon. Jonathan ended the call, breathing heavily. "They've done it," he said flatly, phone clenched in his fist. "The board held an emergency session, probably orchestrated by my father. They've frozen my personal accounts pending an official investigation. They claim I've committed financial improprieties." He let out a humorless laugh. Financial improprieties? Meanwhile, they're the ones laundering bribes. Megan's face went pale. So, everything you have is locked up? He nodded, struggling to keep his voice steady. My credit cards, my checking account, any liquid assets? They're basically boxing me out. I can't pay the security detail, can't access funds to protect you and the twins. They're forcing my hand. Grace approached, anger flashing in her eyes. Jonathan, I'll stay. We'll figure out a way around this. He gave her a tight nod, thankful for her unwavering loyalty. You might be the only ally I have left, he said, glancing at Megan. Besides you, of course. Fear flickered across Megan's features, and she looked away, pressing her lips together. I don't want to go back to living on the streets, she whispered, voice taut. But if you're losing everything, maybe I should just— No, Jonathan said firmly, stepping closer. Don't even think that. This isn't your fault. It's mine for letting them manipulate me so long. We stand together, or we let them win. The words radiated conviction, but beneath the surface, his heart hammered with doubt. How was he supposed to protect her and the twins if he couldn't even foot the bill for basic necessities? Evening found them gathered in the living room again, a single floor lamp casting warm light over worried faces. They ate a simple meal of leftovers, trying to keep the mood calm for the twins, who seemed to understand there was trouble, but didn't fully grasp its scope. Megan sat with one daughter on her lap, the other leaning against Jonathan as he read from a battered children's book. For a brief moment, the tension receded, replaced by the soft hush of bedtime story magic. But once the girls were asleep in the small bedroom, the reality crashed down. Jonathan stepped outside to pace along the townhouse's front walkway. A half-moon hung in the sky, pale and distant, offering little comfort. In the silence, he imagined every shutter of a camera, every shadow possibly belonging to a hired goon from the board or a sneering reporter lying in wait. Behind him, the door opened, and Megan stepped out onto the porch, arms wrapped around herself against the chill. "You all right?" she asked, her voice gentle. He stared at the cracked concrete under his shoes, torn between anger and despair. "I poured my life into that company," he said, "and now they're tearing it all away, freezing my assets, labeling me a criminal. This is what happens when you cross them." Megan laid a hand on his back. "They're showing you who they really are," she murmured, "and who you don't want to be." He turned to face her, the faint porch light illuminating the worry in her eyes. "I wish I could give you more security," he said, voice nearly a whisper. "I feel like I'm failing you and the twins." She shook her head, stepping closer. "You're not failing us. For the first time, I see you standing up to them, even if it cost you everything. That means more than any house or paycheck." Their eyes locked for a moment, unspoken understanding passing between them. Then, almost reluctantly, they went inside. Grace was seated at the kitchen table, rifling through more paperwork. She looked up, exhaustion tugging at her features. "I've been scanning documents again," she said quietly. "There's more. Illegal payoffs, hidden under multiple shell companies, enough to bury the entire board if it goes public." Jonathan felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with dread. "But how can we release it without resources or legal protection?" Grace exhaled. "That's the question. And time's running out." They agreed to take turns staying awake, just in case more trouble arrived overnight. Megan insisted Jonathan get some rest, so he reluctantly settled onto the couch. She and Grace remained at the table, poring over data in hushed whispers. The weight of the day's events pulled him into a troubled sleep, full of half-formed nightmares about corporate betrayals and locked doors. He woke hours later, startled by the sound of Grace's voice, urgent but muted. She stood in the dim light of the kitchen, phone in hand, rummaging through yet another stack of incriminating files. Jonathan rubbed sleep from his eyes, pushing himself to sit up. "What is it?" he asked, heart pounding. Grace turned to him, a triumphant yet anxious glint in her eyes. "I've just accessed a few more archived documents. If these are genuine, we can prove the board not only bribed Megan but also laundered money through dummy charities. This might be enough to take them all down." Jonathan rose unsteadily to his feet as Megan hovered in the background, looking pale and tired. "Show me," he said. Grace handed him a series of printouts, each bearing official logos, signatures, and dates. At the bottom of every page, the same names kept appearing, linked to questionable transactions that spanned years. He recognized them instantly as major players across the city, untouchable men and women he'd always believed were pillars of the community. A strange hush filled the room as Jonathan understood the full magnitude of what they'd uncovered. "This is bigger than my father," he murmured, voice hollow. "They're all in on it." Megan rubbed her arms as though trying to ward off a chill. "So what do we do?" Before Jonathan could answer, Grace's phone chimed again. She glanced at the screen, her mouth set in a tight line. Then she looked up, meeting Jonathan's eyes. "I've just confirmed something else. The assets freeze is complete. They're shutting you out entirely, and it's already hit the media." A wave of nausea twisted in Jonathan's gut. He had no funds, no immediate safety net, and an unstoppable scandal at his door. This was indeed rock bottom. He closed his eyes, drawing a shallow breath. He had prepared himself for the possibility of losing his company, but seeing it all happen so fast was a shock he couldn't quite absorb. Megan touched his arm, her voice trembling with both concern and resolve. "We'll figure it out," she said, swallowing hard. "You've still got us." He managed a faint smile, though tears of frustration threatened to surface. "I won't let them scare me into silence." He squeezed Megan's hand, then turned to Grace. "We release everything we have to the press tomorrow morning. No more delays." Grace nodded, though her eyes betrayed her fear for him. "Right. Then let's hope the law sides with the truth." Night closed in once more, heavy with tension. Jonathan tried to steady his racing heart, focusing on the single thread of purpose that remained, protecting Megan, caring for the twins, and seeing justice done. As the first faint glow of dawn crept through the windows, Grace looked up from the final stack of documents and spoke quietly into the hush. "Jonathan, I found something else buried in these files. You need to see this signature. It's high profile, connected to some of the city's most influential families." He turned, exhaustion evaporating in a rush of adrenaline. "Who is it?" he asked, voice shaking. Her eyes were wide, voice low. "You won't believe the signatures I've found. This goes higher than we ever imagined." Morning came heavy with anticipation, the gray sky outside matching Jonathan's restless mood. He stood in the living room next to Megan, holding her hand in a silent gesture of resolve. Across the worn coffee table, Grace sifted through the final stack of documents. Weeks of secrecy, fear, and doubt had led them to this pivotal day, a day they planned to expose the truth, no matter the personal cost. The twins woke earlier than usual, sensing the tension in the townhouse. Megan offered them gentle smiles and a light breakfast, though her own appetite was gone. Jonathan tried to joke with the girls, but his laughter sounded hollow. Their bright eyes scanned his face, intuitively picking up the worry he struggled to hide. Once the children were occupied with crayons and paper, he and Megan slipped to the far end of the room where Grace waited. "The press conference is set," Grace announced quietly. She held up a phone showing a schedule. "I contacted a handful of reporters who pride themselves on real journalism, not just sensationalism. They're ready to go live as soon as we show the evidence." Megan drew a shaky breath. "How many of the board members do you think will come?" Grace glanced at Jonathan. "Half are probably avoiding this entire mess. But I managed to coax a few into showing up. Those not directly involved in the bribery. They want to distance themselves from the scandal and might back you up if the evidence is strong." Jonathan nodded, adrenaline coursing through him. "It's time. We can't keep letting them control the narrative." They gathered their files and slipped into the car, leaving a trusted security guard behind to watch the twins. Though Megan hated the idea of separating from the girls, she knew it was safer for them to stay hidden until after the conference. As Jonathan drove, his mind spun with everything at stake: the frozen assets, the threat of blackmail, the risk of public ruin. It paled in comparison to the knowledge that his own father and business partners had orchestrated Megan's disappearance, and possibly countless other cover-ups, for years. They arrived at a modest building downtown, one often used for community events and smaller press gatherings. Outside, a handful of cameras already buzzed with activity, curious reporters murmuring about the sudden notice. Jonathan parked discreetly, waiting for Megan and Grace to collect themselves before heading in. Once inside, they found a small, sparsely decorated room with a makeshift podium and rows of chairs. A few board members milled around, trying to appear casual. Jonathan recognized the uneasy glances they cast him. Word had spread that he intended to make a major announcement. On the opposite side of the room, reporters checked microphones and camera angles, each vying for the best vantage point. Megan stood behind Jonathan, bracing for the crowd's scrutiny. He felt her hand trembling against his back. "You don't have to speak if you're not ready," he whispered. She swallowed hard, eyes dark with resolved fear. "I need them to hear it from me." Grace stepped up to the podium first, introducing herself and giving a brief explanation of why they had called this conference. Her voice held an edge of urgency as she explained that Jonathan Turner, CEO of Turner Enterprises, had uncovered serious allegations against current and former members of the board. When Jonathan took her place, a hush fell over the room. Cameras clicked, recorders beeped, and a dozen pairs of eyes bored into him. For an instant, he wondered if the words would stick in his throat. Then he looked at Megan, recalling the pain of her years in hiding, and drew courage from her presence. He began calmly, recounting how he discovered multiple fraudulent transactions and hush-money payouts designed to remove obstacles or people who threatened the company's pristine image. His voice wavered only when he spoke of how these secret deals had torn apart families, including his own. Megan stepped forward then, speaking in a clear, if trembling, tone. She described how she had been paid to disappear, forced to raise twin girls alone, living in constant fear. The press hung on her every word. Flashes from cameras lit her face, capturing both the anger and heartbreak she had carried for so long. Across the aisle, Jonathan spotted a group of stony-faced executives, one of them being the older partner who had threatened him in that high-end restaurant. The man's expression soured as Megan spoke, and he crossed his arms, looking ready to bolt. The tension reached a breaking point when Jonathan held up copies of the documents, signatures of board members, clear evidence of financial impropriety, and even hush money funneled through phony charities. A rumble of shock spread through the reporters. Suddenly, questions erupted. Who orchestrated all this? Was your father involved? Why didn't you come forward sooner? In the midst of the clamor, Jonathan's father appeared, flanked by two stern-looking associates. The older man strode to the front, attempting to hush the room with a curt gesture. For a moment, everyone fell silent, awaiting some grand denial. But no denial came. Instead, Jonathan's father glared at him, voice low and filled with warning. "You're making a spectacle," the elder Turner snapped. "This is a private matter that should have stayed within the family." A wave of anxious whispers rippled through the audience. Jonathan clenched his jaw, stepping closer to the microphone. "That's the problem," he said, his voice echoing. "It wasn't just our family. This conspiracy hurt countless people." The father tried to speak again, but the reporters bombarded him with questions, brandishing copies of the newly released documents. Cameras pivoted, capturing his stiff posture, the sweat forming on his brow. Sensing the momentum, Grace called two supportive board members to the podium. They confirmed that they had witnessed questionable dealings, though they were too frightened to speak up until now. Their admissions fueled the outcry, and chaos ensued as more executives scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. One by one, they either marched out in indignation or stammered feeble denials. Meghan stood to one side, feeling an odd mixture of terror and liberation. Part of her expected someone to grab her arm, drag her away, or shout that she had no right to be there. But each passing minute, the damning evidence flooded the room, and the conspirators had no defense but feeble sputtering. At last, a respected journalist from a major network spoke up, commanding the crowd's attention. She glanced at Jonathan and Meghan, then at the documents in her hands. "If these allegations hold," she said, "we could be looking at the largest corporate scandal this city has seen in decades. Do you expect legal action?" "Arrests?" Jonathan replied, struggling to keep his voice even. "I've turned over copies to a legal team. They'll determine whether criminal charges apply. But from what we've discovered, it's inevitable that several key players will face serious repercussions." A flurry of new questions followed, and Jonathan did his best to address them. Meghan watched as his father and other implicated board members retreated, muttering angrily. Their once unshakable confidence had crumbled under the onslaught of public scrutiny. For so long, they had hidden behind wealth and influence, but now the bright glare of cameras and truth showed their human frailty. Then, as the press conference wound down, Jonathan's eyes darted to Meghan. A hush settled over him, and he lowered the microphone. "Is there anything else you'd like to say?" he murmured, turning to her. She approached slowly, heart pounding. At first, she could only stare at the half-empty chairs, the cluster of reporters, and the bright lights. "I just want people to know," she began, her voice unsteady, "that no one deserves to be cast aside like an inconvenience. My daughters and I spent years living in fear because of greed and cruelty. If this helps prevent another family from going through the same, then maybe the truth is worth it." The cameras flashed again, capturing her teary expression, and the room fell into a hush. In that fragile moment, a sense of relief washed over Meghan. She hadn't wanted to stand in front of cameras, but she couldn't deny the release of finally speaking openly. Jonathan wrapped an arm around her shoulders, guiding her gently away from the podium. The reporters continued hurling questions, some desperate for a juicy angle, others genuinely shaken by the enormity of the scandal. Outside the building, a sea of camera crews waited for statements, amplifying the sensation that the entire city now knew their story. They stepped into the corridor, hearts pounding. A few sympathetic board members trailed after them, stunned by the revelations. Meghan recognized the confusion etched on their faces. Once loyal to the old guard, they now saw the monstrous betrayal that lay beneath the surface. Grace caught up, her phone buzzing non-stop. She exchanged a wordless nod with Jonathan as if to say, "We did it. For better or worse, we've exposed them." In the hushed pause that followed, Jonathan glanced at Meghan. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She pressed her lips into a trembling smile. "I think so. For the first time, I actually believe there might be a way forward without running." He brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "Good," he whispered. "Let's get out of here before someone else corners us for an interview." As they walked toward the exit, the low hum of reporters and staff still filled the air, but there was a sense of finality, as though a chapter of deception had closed. Grace gripped her folder tightly, eyes shining with a mix of relief and apprehension. Jonathan's father and the others who had conspired against Meghan had fled in disarray, yet their influence was far from gone. Before stepping outside into the bright daylight and the throng of cameras, Jonathan paused, glancing back at the emptying room. His voice, quiet but unwavering, reached Meghan and Grace. "This might just be the beginning of our biggest battle." The roar of camera shutters still echoed in Jonathan's mind as he and Meghan left the press conference. Outside, they were greeted by an onslaught of reporters calling out their names, questions flying like arrows through the crisp daylight. Security helped guide them into a waiting car, and they sped away from the chaos, the files and evidence that had blown the conspiracy wide open now in safe hands. Neither spoke for a few blocks, both trying to process that the truth was finally out and that nothing would be the same again. When they arrived back at the townhouse, they found the twins in the living room coloring quietly under the watchful eye of the security guard. The sight of those small faces, so full of hope and innocence, nearly shattered Jonathan. He inhaled a slow, shaky breath, reminded that despite the monumental upheaval, some things mattered more than board meetings and bottom lines. Megan knelt to hug her daughters, tears glistening on her cheeks. Jonathan watched as the twins squealed in delight at her return, the sound banishing the echo of shouting reporters for a moment. "They saw some of it on the news," the security guard said gently, "but I tried to keep the coverage to a minimum so they wouldn't get upset." Jonathan closed his eyes in silent gratitude. He thanked the guard, then crouched beside Megan and the girls. "I'm sorry if it all seemed scary," he said in a soft tone, offering the children a reassuring smile. One twin blinked up at him. "They showed you on TV. You looked serious." Jonathan mustered a laugh at the understatement. "I was, but it's going to be okay." Megan stood, guiding the twins toward the couch for a snack. Jonathan followed, and as they settled into a semblance of normalcy, a fruit bowl on the coffee table, juice boxes for the girls, a ring from his phone broke the brief calm. He glanced at the screen, saw a flurry of missed calls, texts, and messages from old acquaintances, employees, even friends who'd drifted away. News of the scandal had spread like wildfire, and people either wanted clarity or to distance themselves. He shot Megan a weary look and silenced the device. "I can't handle more interviews right now," he murmured. She nodded, brushing the hair from one twin's eyes. Together, they let the rest of the world spin on while they soaked in a rare, quiet family moment. By nightfall, updates began pouring in. Grace arrived at the townhouse, breathless excitement lighting her face. "Several top board members have resigned," she said, setting her purse on the kitchen table. "Those who stayed are promising cooperation with the authorities. And your father?" Her voice trailed off, sympathy flashing in her eyes. Jonathan's stomach clenched. "What about him?" Grace exhaled. He released a statement denying everything at first, but too much evidence pinned him down. "He's under investigation, Jonathan." The room fell silent. Megan slipped her hand into Jonathan's, a subtle show of support. Jonathan swallowed the knot in his throat. He loved his father once, or the idea of him, mentor, protector. Now that man stood exposed as the architect of countless manipulations, who had nearly destroyed Megan's life and robbed Jonathan of the chance to know his daughters. Even so, hearing that he might face criminal repercussions felt like a bitter victory. "That's one more step toward justice," Jonathan finally said, voice low. "I just hope it's enough for Megan, for all the other people they hurt." Megan's fingers squeezed his. "We don't have to celebrate his downfall," she murmured, "but let's hope this brings closure." It was nearly midnight when more calls rolled in, though Jonathan chose only to answer the urgent ones. One was from a small group of shareholders who admitted they were backing him wholeheartedly. The boldness with which he had exposed the company's corruption struck a chord with them. They saw in it a kind of ethical leadership that could salvage the firm's reputation. "Your honesty might be the only thing that can save Turner Enterprises now," one shareholder confessed over the phone. Jonathan thanked them, though he wasn't certain saving the company was even feasible, or if he still wanted to be at the helm. Days stretched into a tense week. Investigators swarmed corporate headquarters, and the media spotlight stayed glued on the scandal. Jonathan's face appeared on every major channel, with experts analyzing his press conference performance. Oddly enough, public opinion began to shift in his favor. The more people learned about the conspiracy, the more they sympathized with the man who'd risked everything, including his own fortune, to expose it. Megan watched the coverage with cautious optimism. "Strange how that works," she mused one evening. "They spent so long painting you as some heartless billionaire, but all it took was the truth to flip the narrative." "People love a redemption story," Jonathan said wryly, though he felt relief that the tide was turning. "I just wish it hadn't cost us so much." In the midst of legal battles, statements, and depositions, Jonathan found himself forging an unexpected path to rebuild his life. Many older associates cut him off, seeing him as a turncoat who had shattered the status quo. But younger entrepreneurs and socially conscious investors reached out, offering solidarity. A restructured board, mostly made up of new faces, approached him, urging him to stay on as CEO under new ethical guidelines. Jonathan's heart twisted at the irony. The honesty he had displayed might end up saving the company he once feared losing. He waited, uncertain if he even wanted the role anymore. Each day he returned to the townhouse, greeted by the twins' laughter, Megan's warm if still cautious smile. Their presence reminded him of what truly mattered. He spent mornings taking the girls to a local park, letting them run around grassy fields. Megan often joined, even though she still scanned her surroundings, worried some remnant of the past might lunge out to haunt her. But each evening, they made a family dinner, something that felt almost surreal after the motel rooms and constant fleeing. One afternoon, news broke that arrests had been made. Jonathan's father, along with a core group of conspirators, had been taken into custody. Megan's hands shook when she saw the news flash. She turned off the TV, uncertain how to feel. Jonathan sat beside her on the couch, arms circling her shoulders. "It's over," he whispered, though he wasn't entirely sure if all the fallout had finished. She laid her head on his chest, letting relief mingle with sadness. Grace arrived soon after, her face glowing with satisfaction. "They've confessed," she said, voice trembling with excitement. "Your father and 2 main board members admitted to orchestrating years of hush-money schemes. They're naming others, too." "Who'd have thought," Jonathan murmured, rubbing his temple, "that exposing them would eventually help the company's reputation? Investors are responding well to the transparency. It's surreal." Megan watched him carefully. "So, what does this mean for you?" For a moment, Jonathan didn't reply. He remembered the old dream, being a titan of industry, leading the empire his father had started, forging alliances across the global market. That dream had grown tainted by deception, yet the new vision, one of accountability and genuine compassion, kindled something more authentic. He couldn't deny that part of him wanted to stay and reshape Turner Enterprises into something honorable. He looked at Megan, then at the twins chasing each other around the living room. "It means I get to decide who I am without my father's meddling," he said softly. "I can walk away from all of it, or I can rebuild with integrity. Maybe both." She smiled, a gentle curve that spoke of acceptance. "I support whichever choice brings you peace," she told him. "But you should know, the girls are happy here. I'm happy here. We're not running anymore." His throat tightened, tears pricking his eyes at her words. He swallowed and managed to nod. "Then we'll make a new start, right here." That evening, Jonathan signed a new contract, one that reappointed him as CEO under strict guidelines for transparency, ethics, and charitable commitments. He felt no triumph in the usual sense, only a sober gratitude for the chance to rectify the company's path. After the meeting concluded, he walked out into the warm dusk, where Megan and the twins waited, arms wrapped around each other for support. They headed home to the townhouse, exhausted but hopeful. Inside, the twins were too excited to sleep, bouncing on the couch with grins that lit up their faces. Megan managed to herd them into pajamas, but not before Jonathan promised a bedtime story. He picked a silly tale about a bear who couldn't stop sneezing, the girls giggling each time he imitated the bear's achoo. When at last they drifted off, Megan lingered in the doorway, watching Jonathan tuck the blankets around them with surprising gentleness. She joined him in the hall, and for a moment, neither spoke. Then he set his hand on her shoulder, gaze full of unspoken apologies and lingering hope. "I never imagined I'd be here," he confessed, voice barely above a whisper. "Losing my illusions, my father's respect, maybe even my old identity. But you and the girls, you made me see what's important." Megan laid her head against his shoulder, eyes shining. "Sometimes losing everything you thought mattered is what leads you to what really does." They shared a quiet laugh, wrapped in that fragile new understanding. They weren't certain what the future would hold. Lawsuits, reorganizing the company, a father facing jail time, or a public still hungry for dramatic headlines. But at the heart of it all, they had each other and the two bright-eyed daughters who'd brought them together again. Grace dropped by to share a small toast, non-alcoholic cider in paper cups. "To new beginnings," she said, and they all sipped with subdued smiles. Later that night, Jonathan stood by the window, gazing out at the city lights. Megan joined him, slipping her hand into his. Their reflections glimmered in the glass, a once powerful CEO and a woman who'd spent years on the run, now bound by something deeper than wealth or status. He drew in a slow breath, recalling all they'd overcome: conspiracies, betrayals, the relentless gaze of the media, and the heartbreak of lost time. It was messy, and there were no guarantees, but at least they walked forward honestly. He turned to her, voice soft. "Thank you for trusting me enough to stay." She smiled, lips trembling ever so slightly. "Thank you for finally standing beside me when it counted." They leaned in close, foreheads touching in a quiet moment of understanding. The future stretched before them, challenging, uncertain, but undeniably alive with possibility. And somewhere in the silent space that followed, Jonathan realized just how far they had come, and how precious every step forward would be. Sometimes the greatest investment of all is the one we make in our hearts. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Just click on the screen.